Something about this story feels unfinished. Not because the footage was shocking, but because of what happened immediately after it surfaced. The clip appeared, spread quickly, and then something strange followed. The noise stopped. There was no clear explanation, no detailed breakdown, no urgent statement to shut the rumors down. Just distance, silence, and carefully measured appearances. People expected outrage or denial. Instead, they got restraint. And restraint, in situations like this, makes people uncomfortable. Viewers didn't just focus on the viral footage, they focused on the reaction gap. The time between what people saw and what they were not told. That gap is where theories began to grow. Old moments were suddenly reconsidered. Neutral interactions felt loaded. Ordinary absences started to feel intentional. What unsettled fans most wasn't the allegation being whispered online. It was how quickly the people involved seemed to step away from the conversation entirely, as if acknowledging it might give it more power than ignoring it ever could. And then came the question no one has been able to answer clearly. If this moment was being blown out of proportion, why did it quietly change the energy around everyone involved? Before the clip ever appeared, there was already a story forming in the background, quietly, slowly, and without most people realizing it. Rada and Nadia Nakai had existed in the same public space for years, often adjacent but never overtly intertwined. They shared industry circles, overlapping events, and mutual visibility, yet their dynamic was defined more by proximity than closeness. To casual observers, nothing about this stood out. But to long-time followers, that balance mattered. Because when a dynamic is steady, even small changes feel noticeable. For a long time, things appeared neutral between them. There were no public disagreements, no visible tension, no dramatic separation that screamed conflict. They acknowledged each other when necessary and moved within the same orbit without friction. This kind of quiet coexistence rarely attracts attention, but it sets expectations. And expectations are what make patterns visible when they shift. Months before the viral footage entered the conversation, some viewers began noticing subtle differences. Nothing concrete. No single moment that could be isolated as a breaking point. Instead, it came through absence. Fewer shared appearances in places where overlap once felt routine. Less casual acknowledgement online. Small changes that, taken individually, meant nothing, but together raised quiet questions among fans who had been paying close attention. What complicated these observations was timing. These shifts seemed to occur during periods when pressure across their wider circle appeared higher. Increased public scrutiny. Heightened emotional moments. Busy schedules layered with personal visibility. For many watchers, this context mattered. Stress changes how people interact, even without conflict, and that possibility left room for interpretation without certainty. Rada's public behavior during this phase became a focal point for speculation, not because of what she said, but because of how she appeared. Interviews felt shorter, responses more measured. Her tone, still composed, carried less openness than before. Some interpreted this as maturity or professionalism. Others sensed emotional restraint. Both readings could exist at the same time without contradicting one another. Nadia, on the other hand, maintained a consistent outward presence but appeared more selective with visibility. Supporters pointed out that this could easily be a deliberate personal boundary. Critics noted that it appeared unusually timed. Again, no proof, just perception. And in gossip culture, perception often moves faster than facts. What's important here is that none of these moments, on their own, suggested conflict. There were no confrontations captured, no explicit statements hinting at tension. But patterns don't announce themselves. They emerge slowly, often only visible in hindsight. Fans didn't believe something was wrong, they believed something had shifted. This is why the footage, when it finally surfaced, landed with such force. Not because it confirmed anything, but because it arrived in a space already filled with unanswered feelings. A narrative doesn't start when footage appears, it starts when people are emotionally prepared to see meaning in it. Early doubts weren't about accusations or blame. They were about energy, about consistency, about questions like, why now? Why the distance? Why the restraint? These questions didn't demand answers yet, but they lingered. By the time the clip began circulating online, audiences weren't encountering a blank situation. They were encountering a moment layered onto months of quiet observation. And that history made silence afterward feel heavier than it might have otherwise. At this point in the story, nothing had been said. Nothing had been confirmed. But something had been noticed. And in the world of public narratives, noticing is often the first step toward speculation, whether fair or not. Once the clip entered public circulation, the focus quietly began to shift. It was no longer just about background patterns or subtle changes over time. Attention moved outward, toward reactions, or more accurately, the absence of them. Viewers waited for immediate clarification, expecting the familiar rhythm of statements, denials, or explanations that usually follow viral moments. But that rhythm never arrived. And the delay itself became a story. People began comparing appearances before and after the footage spread. In interviews and public moments that followed, every pause felt heavier. Shorter answers were analyzed for tone rather than meaning. A calm expression was labeled as composure by some and emotional distance by others. Body language became a language of its own, one that audiences tried to translate frame by frame. What stood out to many was restraint. There were no visible emotional outbursts, no dramatic gestures toward the situation. For some viewers, that restraint suggested professionalism or advice to stay quiet. For others, it created discomfort. Gossip culture feeds on visible reaction, and when that reaction doesn't arrive, imagination fills the gap. Silence, in this case, didn't quiet the conversation, it redirected it. Without official narratives to guide interpretation, viewers began constructing their own. Small moments were elevated in significance. A delayed post, a neutral caption, an appearance that felt slightly more controlled than usual. None of these proved anything, but collectively they shaped how the story was perceived. This is where rumors quietly entered the space. Not as verified claims, but as questions phrased as possibility. Comments asking whether something more serious had happened. Posts wondering if private actions had taken place off camera. The idea of consequences began circulating, even without clear origins. Importantly, these rumors had no confirmed source, only repetition. Speculation was rarely direct. Instead of statements, it arrived through implication. Does anyone else notice? Something feels off. Why hasn't this been addressed yet? These phrases allowed conversations to grow without anyone taking responsibility for certainty. That made the narrative flexible, and therefore more shareable. What emotionally anchored this story for audiences wasn't shock, it was discomfort. The feeling that something important was being managed quietly, while the public was left watching from the outside. People don't just respond to drama, they respond to exclusion. When viewers sense they're seeing only the edges of a situation, curiosity deepens instead of fading. Interviews from this period were revisited with different eyes. Neutral phrasing was reinterpreted. Long pauses between answers were read as calculated. Even unrelated discussions were filtered through the same lens of suspicion, not because they confirmed anything, but because they occurred in the same emotional timeline. At the same time, voices urging restraint tried to push back. Some fans reminded others that viral footage rarely tells the full story. That silence can be protective rather than revealing. That privacy is not the same as guilt. These arguments slowed the narrative but didn't stop it. Emotion tends to outweigh logic in moments fueled by uncertainty. As days passed with no clear resolution, tension didn't spike, it settled. And that made it more unsettling. Instead of a single dramatic peak, the story flattened into something quieter but heavier. A lingering sense that whatever had happened was being absorbed privately, rather than resolved publicly. This is why the narrative stuck. Not because of what was said or proven, but because of what remained unresolved. The footage became less important than the atmosphere surrounding it. And in that atmosphere, curiosity didn't disappear, it matured. By this point, the audience wasn't just watching for answers anymore. They were watching for signs. And signs, unlike statements, are open to interpretation. By this stage, the story had moved beyond events and into perception. What people were responding to was no longer the footage or the rumors themselves, but the emotional weight created by everything that wasn't being clarified. Silence had become the most powerful element in the narrative, not because it revealed facts, but because it invited interpretation. Psychologically, silence rarely feels neutral to an audience. When viewers are emotionally invested and expect explanation, quietness creates imbalance. The mind naturally tries to restore that balance by filling in gaps. Sometimes those gaps are filled with reasonable possibilities. Other times, they're filled with fear, suspicion, or imagined intent. In highly visible situations, this process accelerates, because thousands of people are filling the same gap at the same time. What complicates matters is optics. Visual moments, even brief ones, often feel more convincing than verbal explanations. A pause can feel intentional. A controlled expression can feel calculated. Yet optics are shaped by context the viewer doesn't have access to. The camera captures fragments, not motives. Still, fragments are powerful when they align with an already unsettled narrative. As the conversation continued online, it became clear that many were no longer asking what happened, but why nothing was being said. For some, this reinforced the idea that silence must be strategic, suggesting legal caution or behind-the-scenes management. For others, it opened the door to something more personal, the possibility that restraint was an attempt to protect emotions, relationships, or private realities that don't belong in public spaces. There are explanations that don't rely on wrongdoing at all. Privacy is one of them. Not every moment captured on video demands public interpretation. Protection is another. Choosing not to respond can sometimes be a way to avoid worsening a situation that feels already distorted. Then there is complexity, the reality that situations involving multiple people, histories, and pressures rarely reduce cleanly into one clear narrative. But complexity doesn't trend well. Reflection doesn't go viral. What holds attention is uncertainty paired with emotion. And this story had both. The refusal to clarify didn't necessarily mean something was being hidden, but it did mean the audience remained outside the truth. That distance is uncomfortable. It forces viewers to confront their own role in shaping narratives from incomplete information. Are we responding to reality, or to the patterns we think we recognize? Importantly, no definitive conclusion ever arrived. No moment closed the loop. And in storytelling, unresolved endings linger longer than resolved ones. They stay because the mind keeps returning to them, searching for meaning that may not exist in simple form. At this point, the truth remains suspended, not because it's unreachable, but because it's undefined. And perhaps that's the most honest outcome. Some stories don't conclude with answers. They conclude with awareness. Awareness of how easily silence can feel suspicious, of how quickly optics can overpower facts, and of how narratives are shaped not just by what's done, but by what's left unsaid. Now, this is where the story shifts from observation to conversation, because at this point, it no longer belongs to just the people involved. It belongs to everyone watching it unfold from the outside, trying to understand what silence, timing, and restraint really mean. Some viewers feel that choosing not to speak is a form of responsibility, that not every moment deserves public explanation, especially when fact and rumor are moving at different speeds. Others feel that silence, in highly visible situations, creates space for misunderstanding and emotional damage that could have been avoided with clarity. Both perspectives can exist without cancelling the other out. So we want to hear from you. Do you think silence protects people, or does it unintentionally raise more questions? When clips go viral without context, should those involved feel obligated to respond, or is restraint the wiser choice? And how much responsibility do audiences carry when they turn fragments into full narratives? This channel isn't about rushing to judgment. It's about slowing the story down enough to see the layers beneath the noise. If you notice something others might have missed, or if you disagree with the dominant conversation, share your perspective in the comments. Respectful discussion is always welcome here, and different viewpoints help create a fuller picture. If this breakdown made you reflect rather than react, take a moment to like the video so more people can join the conversation. Subscribe to the channel for thoughtful, long-form gossip storytelling that focuses on nuance instead of conclusions. And turn on notifications, because stories like this don't usually end loudly, they evolve quietly, through timing, silence, and subtle shifts that only become clear later. And sometimes, the most important part of a story isn't what's revealed at the end. It's what remains unanswered long after the noise fades.